It was an ordinary morning in the small town of Brookside, a place where everyone seemed to know everyone, and life ambled along at a steady, unremarkable pace. Marcus Jones, a dedicated businessman and a respected member of the community, started his day with the familiar routine he cherished: a quiet walk through town followed by breakfast at Ellie's Eats. The diner had been a fixture in Brookside for decades, known for its hearty meals and close-knit community atmosphere. It wasn't unusual to see the same faces in the booths every morning, from retirees chatting over coffee to local workers grabbing a quick bite before their day began. Marcus had always appreciated the warmth of these morning rituals. Having grown up in Brookside, he poured years of hard work into building his business, a small but successful auto repair shop on the edge of town. He'd always felt a mixture of pride and gratitude for the life he had built from modest beginnings. But today, as he entered Ellie's Eats, something was different. He noticed the looks almost immediately, a slight shift in the room as eyes turned to him, and then quickly looked away. He felt a twinge of discomfort, but brushed it off, telling himself it was nothing more than a coincidence. He approached the counter and took a seat, nodding politely at a few familiar faces. The diner owner, Carl, was standing behind the counter, his arms crossed and his gaze fixed firmly on Marcus. Carl was known for his gruff demeanor, but this was different. There was a harshness in his expression that Marcus hadn't seen before. "Can I help you?" Carl asked, his voice carrying a tone that felt cold and unwelcoming. Marcus, momentarily taken aback, managed a polite smile. "I'll have the usual, Carl," Marcus replied, hoping to ease the tension with a friendly gesture. But instead of the usual nod of acknowledgement, Carl's face tightened. "Actually, I think it's best if you leave," Carl said, his voice low but unmistakably firm. "We don't serve people like you here." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He could feel the eyes of the other diners on him, the collective silence thickening the air. Shocked and unsure of how to respond, Marcus tried to process what had just happened. He glanced around, searching for a friendly face, someone who might step in or say something to diffuse the tension. But all he saw were lowered gazes and uncomfortable shuffles. It was as though the entire diner had decided, in an unspoken agreement, to let this moment pass without objection. Marcus felt his heart pounding. Part of him wanted to demand an explanation, to confront Carl, and make him acknowledge the ugliness of his words. But he could also feel a deep, painful humiliation rising within him, a sensation he hadn't felt in years, not since he was a young boy growing up in a town where he'd often been reminded of his place. He had worked hard to build his life in Brookside, to prove that he belonged just as much as anyone else, and yet here he was, being told he wasn't welcome in a place he had frequented for years. In a calm but strained voice, Marcus managed to respond, "I think I'll take my business elsewhere, Carl." With that, he stood up and walked out, his mind racing with a mix of emotions: anger, shame, disbelief. The morning light outside felt harsh, and as he walked back to his shop, he could feel the weight of the stairs still lingering on his shoulders. The news of the incident spread quickly. Brookside was a small town, and it didn't take long for word to travel that Marcus had been kicked out of Ellie's Eats. People began talking, and while some expressed quiet sympathy for Marcus, others murmured that perhaps he had overreacted or misunderstood Carl's intentions. There were even those who suggested that Marcus had somehow provoked Carl, that he had brought this upon himself. The subtle undercurrent of prejudice, which had always existed in Brookside, seemed to bubble to the surface, dividing the community along uncomfortable lines. But for Marcus, the incident was more than just a single act of discrimination. It was a stark reminder of how fragile acceptance could be, how quickly the sense of belonging he had worked so hard to cultivate could be shattered by a few hateful words. He spent the next few days wrestling with his emotions, torn between the desire to confront Carl and the need to move on, to prove that he was above the ignorance and pettiness that had driven Carl to humiliate him. Yet, as the days passed, Marcus found himself unable to let the incident go. The image of Carl's cold, unyielding expression lingered in his mind, and the shame he had felt in that diner wouldn't dissipate. He realized that this wasn't just about his own pride or reputation. It was about standing up against the quiet prejudice that had taken root in Brookside, the prejudice that had made it so easy for Carl to dismiss him and for the other patrons to remain silent. And so, a plan began to form in Marcus's mind. If Carl didn't want him in his diner, then maybe it was time to turn that diner into a place where everyone was welcome, a place that reflected the values of inclusivity and respect that Marcus had always believed in. It was a bold idea, one that seemed almost impossible given the resources and determination it would require. But the more he thought about it, the more he felt a sense of purpose and resolve. This wasn't just about him. It was about changing the fabric of his town, about challenging the unspoken norms that had allowed discrimination to thrive. The following week, Marcus met with a few trusted friends and colleagues, sharing his vision and seeking their advice. They were initially hesitant, unsure if Marcus's plan was realistic or if it was even worth the risk. But as he explained his reasons, his passion and conviction won them over. Together, they began devising a strategy, one that would allow Marcus to make an offer on Ellie's Eats without Carl ever suspecting his involvement. For Marcus, this was more than just a business decision. It was a mission, a chance to reclaim his dignity and prove that prejudice had no place in his community. As he moved forward with his plan, he could feel a newfound sense of empowerment and determination. This was his chance to turn a painful experience into something meaningful, to take control of his own story, and transform a place of exclusion into a place of welcome and belonging. In the quiet days that followed the incident at Ellie's Eats, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. It wasn't just Carl's actions that stung, but the silence of everyone else in the diner that morning. He had grown up in Brookside, lived his life by the rules, and worked tirelessly to build a name for himself. His auto repair shop wasn't just his livelihood. It was a testament to years of sweat, sacrifice, and determination. The community knew him. They knew his family. How could they stand by it while he was humiliated like that? How could they simply watch, complicit in their silence? As he tried to process everything that had happened, memories of his childhood in Brookside came flooding back. He remembered being one of the few black kids in school, the whispered remarks, the glances that lingered a little too long. Back then, he had learned to brush off those stares, to ignore the subtle insults and passive-aggressive comments. But this felt different. He had built his business from the ground up and had believed he had earned his place in this town. He thought he had shown the community he was here to stay, that he belonged. But in a single humiliating moment, Carl had stripped him of that sense of belonging, reminding him that, in the eyes of some, he would always be an outsider. But the more he dwelled on it, the more determined he became. He couldn't let Carl's actions define his place in Brookside. If he let this pass without action, he knew the quiet prejudice lurking beneath the surface of the town would only grow bolder. Carl wasn't the only one who shared these views. He was just one of the few bold enough to act on them openly. Marcus knew that if he wanted real change, he'd have to confront not just Carl, but the underlying current of discrimination that allowed people like Carl to feel so comfortable in their ignorance. Marcus's resolve began to solidify into a concrete plan. He wouldn't confront Carl in a way that would escalate into something ugly and unsolvable. Instead, he would take a different approach. He would claim Ellie's Eats as his own, but he would do it in a way that was measured, strategic, and completely unexpected. He was no stranger to tough challenges. Building his auto repair shop from the ground up had taught him that. He knew this plan would require not only financial resources, but also patience, discipline, and secrecy. Marcus spent the next few days quietly reaching out to friends and allies, particularly those who had faced discrimination or subtle biases themselves. He confided in Leon, a fellow black entrepreneur who ran a thriving barbershop downtown, and Patricia, a local teacher and community organizer who had long been advocating for greater diversity and inclusion in Brookside schools. Both Leon and Patricia understood what Marcus was going through. They had felt the sting of discrimination in Brookside too, though rarely as overtly as Marcus had at Ellie's Eats. Together, the three of them began to sketch out a plan. Ellie's Eats wasn't just any diner. It was one of the oldest establishments in Brookside, a place that represented both the town's history and, in some ways, its resistance to change. Buying it wouldn't be easy, especially because Carl took great pride in his diner, even if he ran it with an iron fist. The diner had been in his family for generations, and he saw himself as the custodian of its legacy. For Marcus to even have a chance of acquiring it, he would need to approach the sale with caution and tact. That's when they came up with the idea to use an intermediary, a local real estate agent who could make an offer on the diner without revealing Marcus's involvement. The agent, Tom Henson, was a mutual friend, someone they trusted, and who shared their vision for a more inclusive Brookside. Tom was cautious at first. He understood that approaching Carl with an offer for the diner, especially under a veil of secrecy, could backfire. But after hearing Marcus's story and seeing the hurt in his eyes, he agreed to help. With Tom acting as the intermediary, they began crafting the offer. They knew they would need to make it generous enough to pique Carl's interest, especially since he had shown no previous interest in selling. It took several meetings and late-night discussions to nail down the specifics. But finally, they had a solid proposal. Tom would present himself as an investor interested in revitalizing the diner, appealing to Carl's ego by promising to preserve its legacy and make it an even greater community hub. The offer was designed to play on Carl's love for his diner, while keeping Marcus's involvement hidden until the deal was finalized. The day finally came when Tom approached Carl with the proposal. Carl was, unsurprisingly, suspicious. He questioned Tom's motives, wondering why anyone would want to take on the responsibility of Ellie's Eats, a place steeped in tradition and history. But as Tom expertly weaved a story about how the diner could become an even bigger fixture in Brookside, perhaps even a chain, Carl's skepticism began to waver. In a small town like Brookside, the prospect of something as iconic as Ellie's Eats expanding beyond its walls was a rare and tempting opportunity. By the end of their meeting, Carl was visibly intrigued, though he kept his cards close to his chest. Meanwhile, Marcus was dealing with his own set of challenges. Though he was determined to see his plan through, he still felt the weight of doubt from some of his friends and family. His sister, Sarah, was particularly worried. She had seen firsthand how hard he had worked to build his auto repair business, and she feared that this endeavor would only open him up to more pain and disappointment. But Marcus reassured her that this was something he had to do, not just for himself, but for the community. He wanted to create a place where people didn't have to worry about being judged or discriminated against, where they could come together as equals. But as the days passed, Marcus also had to face the harsh reality that not everyone would be on his side. Word had gotten around town about Carl's altercation with Marcus, and while some residents sympathized with him, others were less supportive. Rumors spread that Marcus was stirring up trouble or trying to change Brookside. A few even suggested that he should be grateful for what he had and leave well enough alone. It was disheartening, but it only fueled Marcus's resolve. He realized that creating real change would always come with resistance, and that there would always be those who clung to outdated beliefs. But he wasn't doing this for them. He was doing it for the people who, like him, had felt the sting of exclusion. After a tense week of negotiations, Carl finally agreed to sell. Tom had managed to convince him that this was a golden opportunity, one that would allow him to retire comfortably and pass the diner into capable hands. Marcus could hardly believe it when Tom called him with the news. He had actually done it. He was now the owner of Ellie's Eats, but he knew that the journey was only beginning. This wasn't just about taking ownership of a diner. It was about transforming it into something greater, a place that embodied the values he held dear. With the papers signed and the deal finalized, Marcus set his plan into motion. He decided to keep the news under wraps for a few more days, using the time to prepare for the diner's grand reopening. He wanted to create a space that celebrated diversity, where everyone from all walks of life could feel welcome. He invested in renovations, updating the interior while preserving the classic charm that had made Ellie's Eats so beloved in the first place. He even commissioned local artists to create a mural on one wall, a vibrant piece that depicted Brookside's history, while celebrating its diversity and inclusivity. Finally, the day of the grand reopening arrived. Word had spread that Ellie's Eats was under new management. Though no one knew the identity of the new owner, people gathered outside, curious to see what changes had been made. Some were excited, while others were wary, particularly those who had been loyal patrons under Carl's ownership. Marcus stood in the back, watching as the crowd filled the diner, his heart pounding with a mix of nerves and anticipation. When the moment finally came for him to introduce himself, he took a deep breath and stepped forward. The room fell silent as he took the stage, the familiar faces of his friends, family, and neighbors watching him expectantly. He knew this was his chance to show them who he was and what he stood for, to prove that this was more than just a business venture. It was a vision for a better, more inclusive Brookside. As Marcus stood before the crowd at the grand reopening of Ellie's Eats, he took in the mixture of faces around him. Some familiar, some new, many looking curious, and a few appearing outright skeptical. The diner was filled to capacity, bustling with townspeople who were eager to see what changes had been made under the mysterious new ownership. The familiar hum of conversation filled the air, but a hush fell over the crowd as Marcus stepped to the center of the room. He knew this was his moment, a pivotal opportunity to introduce not just the new face of Ellie's Eats, but also a new spirit of inclusivity and unity for the town of Brookside. Taking a deep breath, Marcus began to speak, his voice steady but carrying the weight of his experiences. He shared a bit about his journey, how he had grown up in Brookside, worked hard to build his business, and had come to believe in the town's potential to become a place of acceptance and unity. He spoke without mentioning the incident with Carl directly, but those who knew the story could read between the lines. He wanted this speech to be about a vision for the future, not a reminder of the ugliness of the past. Marcus knew that holding on to anger wouldn't change the town, but showing them something better just might. The diners listened intently, some nodding along, others watching with expressions of cautious optimism. A few exchanged glances, and Marcus could feel a slight tension in the air. Change wasn't easy for everyone, especially in a place like Brookside, where traditions held a firm grip on people's lives and perspectives. But he kept going, sharing his dream of turning Ellie's Eats into a place that represented everyone in Brookside, where everyone would feel welcome no matter their background. He wanted Ellie's Eats to be a place where new friendships could be formed over coffee and where different perspectives could be shared around a table. As he finished his speech, the crowd erupted in a mixture of applause and murmurs, some people clearly moved, while others seemed hesitant. He knew it would take time for his vision to be embraced by everyone, and that some might never fully accept it. But he was ready for the challenge, determined to create a new atmosphere that would stand as a testament to the values he held dear. But just as he was stepping down, someone in the crowd cleared their throat loudly. Marcus looked up to see an older man, his face hard, his expression unreadable. This man, George Brantley, had been a loyal patron of Carl's, and Marcus knew him as one of the more conservative, unyielding members of the town. George's voice cut through the room, and he asked, "Why do you want to change what's already working?" Some of us liked it just fine the way it was. There was an edge to his words, a clear implication that Marcus's ownership was an unwelcome intrusion into something sacred. Marcus paused, feeling the weight of the challenge in George's question, knowing that this was the kind of resistance he would face, not just from George, but from many others in town who were wary of change. He took a moment to gather his thoughts, then spoke directly to George, his voice calm but resolute. "I'm not here to erase what people loved about Ellie's Eats, George. I'm here to make it a place where everyone feels like they belong. Sometimes, a little change can make things better for everyone. I hope you'll give it a chance." George didn't respond right away, and a few people looked between Marcus and George, wondering if this would turn into a confrontation. But after a long pause, George nodded curtly, though his expression remained unreadable. Marcus knew he hadn't won him over, but it was enough for now. He hoped that with time, George and others like him would see that Ellie's Eats wasn't losing its identity. It was just growing to include more of the people in the town. Over the next few weeks, Marcus threw himself into managing the diner, carefully balancing the legacy of Ellie's Eats with the fresh energy he wanted to bring. He updated the menu to include a broader range of dishes, drawing inspiration from the diverse culinary backgrounds of Brookside's residents. He hired new staff, people from different backgrounds who brought a warmth and vibrancy to the diner that gave it a unique charm. He reached out to local artists to feature their work on the walls, rotating exhibits that reflected the town's culture and history, sparking conversation among patrons. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. As he'd expected, there were plenty of challenges. Some of the older customers were visibly uncomfortable with the changes, grumbling about tradition and how things were better before. A few of Carl's regulars stopped coming altogether, their absence noticeable in the quiet, empty booths. It stung, and there were days when Marcus doubted himself, wondering if he had taken on more than he could handle. He knew the transformation wouldn't happen overnight, but it was hard not to feel the weight of those empty seats, as though they were a testament to the town's resistance to change. One evening, as Marcus was closing up, he saw an envelope slipped under the diner's door. Inside was a letter from someone who claimed to be a longtime patron of Ellie's Eats, accusing Marcus of ruining a town institution and suggesting that he didn't belong in Brookside. The letter was harsh, filled with bitterness, and it brought back the hurt of the original incident with Carl. For a moment, he wondered if they were right, if maybe he was trying to force a change that Brookside simply wasn't ready for. But then he remembered all the support he had received, the customers who came in with smiles and words of encouragement, thanking him for making the diner a place that truly welcomed everyone. A few days later, an unexpected moment reaffirmed his commitment to the diner. An elderly woman named Evelyn, who had been a longtime resident of Brookside and a regular at the diner, came in and asked to speak with him. She took a seat at the counter, her gaze warm but direct. "I knew Ellie," she said, referring to the original owner for whom the diner was named. "She'd have loved what you're doing here, Marcus. She was a woman who believed in kindness and inclusivity. Don't let a few hardheads make you doubt that you're doing the right thing." Her words were a balm to his spirit. Evelyn's endorsement felt like a bridge between the diner's past and its future, a reminder that change didn't have to mean erasing the old, but could instead honor it in new ways. He thanked her, and she smiled, assuring him that she would be there every morning from now on. "Besides," she added with a wink, "I'm a fan of those new blueberry pancakes you've added to the menu." The diner began to attract new customers, people who had always felt a little out of place in Brookside, those who welcomed the chance to gather in a space that felt open and accepting. Young families, college students, and newcomers to the town filled the seats that had once belonged to Carl's regulars, bringing a fresh energy that transformed the atmosphere of Ellie's Eats. And little by little, some of the original patrons returned, curious about the changes and willing to give the new Ellie's Eats a chance. One evening, just as he was locking up, Marcus saw a familiar figure waiting outside the diner. It was Carl. Marcus's heart skipped a beat as he braced himself, unsure of what to expect. Carl approached him, his posture stiff, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Carl cleared his throat and said, "I don't agree with everything you've done, but I'll admit, I was wrong about some things." It was a small admission, but it felt monumental. Marcus knew that Carl's pride wouldn't allow him to say much more, but the fact that he had come at all was something. Carl extended a hand, and Marcus shook it, feeling a tentative sense of peace settle between them. Carl nodded once, then turned and walked away, leaving Marcus standing in the soft glow of the diner's lights, feeling a sense of closure he hadn't thought possible. As the months went by, Ellie's Eats grew into the vision Marcus had always imagined, The diner became more than just a place to eat. It became a symbol of Brookside's slow but steady journey toward inclusivity, a place where people from all walks of life could gather and connect. The walls, now decorated with artwork from local talent, echoed with laughter and lively conversations, each voice contributing to a rich tapestry of community. Marcus often thought back to that first, painful encounter with Carl, the moment that had changed everything. He realized that, in a way, it had been a gift, a catalyst that pushed him to create something beautiful from a place of hurt. Ellie's Eats had become more than just a business to him. It was a testament to resilience, a place that stood as a reminder that change, while difficult, could lead to growth and transformation. The diner's new identity inspired others in Brookside as well. A few local businesses began to adopt similar inclusive policies, and the town itself slowly opened up to events and initiatives that celebrated diversity. The older generation and the newer one began to find common ground, and Marcus's story became something of a legend in Brookside, a tale of turning prejudice into a positive force that reshaped the community. In quiet moments, Marcus would stand by the window, looking out at the bustling street, reflecting on how much had changed. He knew that the road hadn't been easy and that the journey was far from over, but he felt a deep sense of pride and peace. He had taken a place where he was once unwelcome and turned it into a home for everyone. And as he watched the people, as Ellie's Eats flourished under Marcus's ownership, the diner became the center of community life in Brookside in ways that it never had been before. The new energy was palpable. Locals and newcomers, young and old, were drawn to the warm, welcoming environment that Marcus and his team had cultivated. In the mornings, families gathered for breakfast, laughing as children darted around tables. By noon, workers from nearby businesses filled the booths for lunch. And in the evenings, Ellie's Eats became a space for community events, art shows, and small gatherings. The place was thriving, yet the journey wasn't without its share of challenges. Just as Marcus felt the diner was hitting its stride, whispers began circulating about a planned boycott. A group of locals, led by none other than George Brantley, the man who had questioned Marcus during the grand reopening, felt that the diner had lost its identity under Marcus's management. To them, Ellie's Eats was a piece of Brookside's heritage, and they believed that Marcus's vision for inclusivity was, in their words, pushing an agenda. It was clear that he felt threatened by the changes he had implemented, and the idea that the diner should now represent everyone in the town didn't sit well with them. One Friday evening, George and a small group of his followers decided to take a stand. They showed up outside the diner, handing out flyers that read, "Preserve Brookside's heritage. Say no to change for change's sake." They claimed that Marcus's new policies and community events were diluting the traditions that made the diner a beloved institution. The small protest drew the attention of several onlookers, some who stopped to take a flyer, others who looked at the group with open disapproval. Inside, Marcus could see the commotion unfolding just beyond the windows, his heart sinking at the sight. At first, Marcus considered ignoring it, hoping the boycott would fizzle out on its own. But as the protest continued over the next few days, a few loyal customers even stopped coming in. He knew he had to address it, not just for the business, but for what Ellie's Eats had come to represent. It was no longer just a diner. It was a statement, a testament to a town willing to confront and evolve beyond its biases. Marcus decided to face the issue head-on. The following Saturday morning, Marcus held a community breakfast at Ellie's Eats, inviting people from all backgrounds to gather and talk. Word spread quickly. "My grandmother would have loved this," she said, her voice soft with emotion. She always dreamed of Ellie's Eats being a place where everyone could feel at home. Helen thanked Marcus, saying he had honored Ellie's legacy in a way that even Ellie herself might not have imagined. For Marcus, it was the highest compliment he could receive. As the months turned into years, Ellie's Eats became known throughout Brookside as a symbol of progress and inclusivity. People traveled from nearby towns to experience the welcoming atmosphere and to hear the story of how a simple diner had helped bridge a community's divides. Marcus hosted monthly community events, inviting local speakers, artists, and musicians to share their talents and stories. He even started a scholarship fund in Ellie's name, helping young people in the town pursue their dreams, just as he had once dreamed of building a life and business of his own. Through it all, Marcus remained humbled and grateful, often reflecting on how far Ellie's Eats had come. He had transformed a painful experience into a catalyst for change, turning a place of exclusion into a beacon of acceptance. And as he watched the diner thrive, he knew that his journey, filled with struggles, triumphs, and the courage to face opposition, had been worth it. One evening, after a particularly lively community event, Marcus stood alone in the quiet of the empty diner, reflecting on the road that had led him here. He thought about the boy who had once felt out of place in Brookside, the man who had faced prejudice at the hands of Carl, and the community that had come together in ways he could never have anticipated. A profound sense of peace washed over him. Ellie's Eats had grown beyond just a diner. It had become a legacy of unity, resilience, and the power of acceptance. As he turned off the lights and locked up for the night, Marcus couldn't help but smile. He had taken what could have been a moment of defeat and turned it into a story of triumph, not just for himself, but for the entire town. And that, he knew, was something worth celebrating. As Ellie's Eats settled into its new identity, the diner continued to be a gathering place for the Brookside community, a place where conversations flowed as freely as the coffee. It had become more than just a symbol of unity. It was a catalyst for real, meaningful change throughout the town. But as Marcus soon discovered, the impact of Ellie's Eats rippled far beyond its walls, drawing in new challenges, unexpected allies, and opportunities that would reshape not just the diner, but the entire town itself. One afternoon, a small group of high school students approached Marcus with a proposal. Inspired by the inclusive environment at Ellie's Eats, they wanted to host a community forum on issues of diversity and acceptance in Brookside. These students were bright, driven, and eager to bring conversations into the open that most adults in Brookside tended to avoid. They saw Ellie's Eats as the perfect venue for these discussions. Its atmosphere was open and inviting, and under Marcus's ownership, it had become a safe space for everyone. Marcus was immediately on board. He understood that the next generation was key to fostering lasting change, and he saw the courage and determination in these young people as a hopeful sign of progress. Together, they organized a series of events called Brookside Talks, held every Thursday evening at the diner. The events featured guest speakers, local leaders, and even members of the older generation who shared stories of both unity and division from Brookside's past. Brookside Talks quickly became a town-wide phenomenon. Each week, people packed into Ellie's Eats to listen, learn, and engage in heartfelt discussions. Some of the topics were tough, tackling issues of prejudice, economic inequality, and generational divides that had lingered in the town for decades. But the open forum gave people a chance to voice their thoughts, ask questions, and, perhaps most importantly, listen. Slowly, members of the community who had once been divided began to see each other in a different light, recognizing shared experiences and understanding each other's struggles in a way they hadn't before. But not everyone welcomed the changes. A few local business owners, who had once sided with George Brantley's boycott, were less than thrilled about the forum's popularity. They felt that these discussions, especially ones that delved into the town's history of prejudice, cast Brookside in a negative light. They voiced concerns in town meetings, insisting that the events were stirring up unnecessary trouble and dividing the community further. Despite this resistance, Marcus stood firm. He attended the town meetings, respectfully defending the importance of Brookside Talks and the role Ellie's Eats had come to play in the community. He explained that talking openly about difficult subjects wasn't about dividing the town. It was about understanding and healing. Although he knew he wouldn't win everyone over, he believed in the mission, and that belief sustained him through the criticism. Then, in a surprising twist, George Brantley himself stepped forward to support Marcus during one of these town meetings. He acknowledged that he, too, had once felt uncomfortable with the changes, but admitted that Brookside talks had made him think differently about the town's history and his own role in it. George even recounted a moment during one of the talks when he realized he'd held biases he hadn't been fully aware of. His words carried weight, and those in the room who had respected George for years suddenly saw things in a new light. George's endorsement was an unexpected boon for Marcus, one that went a long way in quieting the remaining opposition. As the weeks passed, the ripple effect of Ellie's Eats continued to spread. Local teachers began bringing students to the diner for field trips, where Marcus would share the story of Ellie's transformation. He talked about the power of standing up for oneself, of building bridges instead of walls, and of creating spaces where everyone felt seen and valued. The children, listening with wide-eyed curiosity, often went home and shared Marcus's story with their families, helping to shape the attitudes of the next generation. Around this time, a journalist from a regional newspaper took an interest in Ellie's Eats and its impact on Brookside. She interviewed Marcus, several regular patrons, and even some of the high school students involved in Brookside talks. The article, titled "The Diner That Changed a Town," spread quickly. Soon, Ellie's Eats began to attract attention from people outside Brookside, with visitors coming from neighboring towns and even a few larger cities, eager to experience the unique sense of community the diner had fostered. One weekend, a man named James Lawson arrived at Ellie's Eats. He was a tall, serious-looking man in his early 50s, dressed in a sharp business suit. He introduced himself to Marcus as a consultant for a national chain of community-oriented restaurants. James had read about Ellie's Eats in the newspaper and was intrigued by the diner's story. Over a cup of coffee, James told Marcus that he was looking to open similar spaces across the country, places that would serve good food while also acting as hubs for community engagement. Impressed by Marcus's vision and success, James offered him a partnership. He wanted Marcus to help him create a blueprint for other diners inspired by Ellie's Eats, a model that could foster unity and acceptance in other communities facing similar struggles. James suggested that they could even name the venture Ellie's Legacy, paying homage to the diner's roots while spreading its message far and wide. Marcus was both excited and overwhelmed. This opportunity was enormous, a chance to bring his vision to life on a national scale. But he also felt a pang of hesitation, knowing that such a venture would pull him away from Brookside, the town he had come to love so deeply. Marcus spent days reflecting on James's offer, seeking advice from friends and mentors. He consulted Patricia and Leon, his allies from the early days, and even spoke with George, who had come to respect him deeply. The consensus was clear. Everyone encouraged him to take the opportunity, assuring him that his work in Brookside would continue to thrive, especially with the legacy he'd already built. But Marcus was torn. Ellie's Eats was more than just a business to him. It was his heart and soul, a place where he had planted his hopes and dreams. Then, in another twist, his sister Sarah surprised him with an idea that offered the perfect solution. She suggested that he expand Ellie's Eats into a community cooperative, allowing Brookside's residents to take partial ownership and continue running the diner in his absence. That way, Marcus could pursue his national vision without worrying that Ellie's Eats would lose its soul. He could trust that the people who cared about its mission would protect and nurture it. The cooperative model quickly took shape. Community members could buy small shares in Ellie's Eats, giving them a voice in its operations and a stake in its success. Marcus was deeply moved by how eagerly the townsfolk embraced the idea. Soon, people were signing up, from high school students to retired locals, all wanting to be part of something meaningful. Ellie's Eats had always belonged to the town in spirit, but now it was legally, financially, and emotionally theirs. With the cooperative in place, Marcus finally accepted James's offer. He knew that this was his chance to share the transformative power of Ellie's Eats with the world, to create spaces where people from all walks of life could gather, connect, and grow. Before leaving, he hosted a farewell dinner at the diner, inviting everyone who had been part of his journey. The place was packed that night, filled with laughter, gratitude, and a few tears. As he stood before the crowd, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He thanked the town for trusting him, for standing by him, and for believing in his vision. He shared his hopes for Ellie's legacy, the new venture that would carry Brookside's spirit to towns and cities far beyond. And finally, he encouraged everyone to continue the work they had started together, to make Ellie's Eats a place that would always reflect the best of what Brookside could be. After Marcus left Brookside to begin Ellie's legacy, Ellie's Eats continued to thrive. Under the cooperative's care, it became a symbol of pride for the town, a living reminder of the power of unity, resilience, and change. New generations of Brookside residents grew up hearing the story of how a single act of exclusion had transformed a town, and Ellie's Eats became a cherished landmark, a place of community pride. Meanwhile, Marcus traveled the country, sharing his story and setting up new diners based on the Ellie's model. Each one bore the name Ellie's Legacy, and each became a beacon of inclusivity and community spirit in its own right. Cities and towns that had long been divided found common ground within the walls of these diners, and people from all backgrounds came to see these spaces as places of acceptance, connection, and hope. Years later, when Marcus returned to Brookside to visit Ellie's Eats, he found it as lively as ever, filled with familiar faces and new ones alike. He felt a surge of pride as he stepped through the doors, realizing that, in a way, he had never truly left. Ellie's Eats, and now Ellie's Legacy, was not only a part of Brookside, but a testament to how a single act of courage could ripple out to change lives, communities, and even the world. In the end, Ellie's Eats wasn't just a diner, it was a movement sparked by one man's determination to turn a place of exclusion into a place of belonging. And as long as Ellie's legacy lived on, so would the values that had made it all possible. The power of acceptance, resilience, and community became Marcus's true legacy, a legacy that would carry on for generations to come. Years passed, and Ellie's legacy grew beyond Marcus's wildest dreams. The movement he had started from the small town of Brookside had transformed into a national network of community diners, each one built on the principles of inclusivity, resilience, and unity. Cities and towns across the country welcomed Ellie's Legacy diners into their communities, embracing them as places where diverse people could gather, break bread, and share their stories. Each diner became more than a restaurant. It was a hub for social change, community gatherings, and dialogues that encouraged people to see beyond their differences. In this way, Marcus's vision had created a bridge between worlds that once seemed too different to connect. The success of Ellie's Legacy led to invitations for Marcus to speak at conferences, universities, and even government panels on diversity and community building. His story inspired countless people, and he became a sought-after voice on social impact, empathy, and resilience. Yet despite his growing influence, Marcus never lost touch with the heart of his mission. Every diner that opened, every community that embraced Ellie's Legacy, reminded him of Brookside and the journey that had started it all. Marcus took pride in staying personally connected with each new diner, visiting them whenever he could, talking with the staff, and listening to the stories of patrons who came to find solace and connection in a place that had become synonymous with belonging. But Marcus had also learned that creating a nationwide network of diners with a focus on inclusivity came with its own unique challenges. In some cities, his vision was met with enthusiasm, but in others, it faced resistance from those who feared change or viewed his mission with skepticism. In certain areas, some questioned the need for a social mission attached to a diner, insisting that it was just a place to eat. Marcus heard stories from managers who had been confronted by patrons uncomfortable with the inclusive messaging, by employees who were tested by occasional visitors, looking to challenge the diner's open atmosphere. Yet, despite these moments of resistance, Ellie's Legacy persevered, and over time, The diners became sanctuaries of understanding and acceptance, transforming even the skeptics who had once opposed them. One of the most significant moments for Marcus came a few years after he had left Brookside. He received a letter from an unexpected source. Carl, the previous owner of Ellie's Eats, the man who had once barred him from the diner. It was a simple, handwritten letter, but as Marcus read, he could feel the weight of years in every line. Carl's words were full of regret and reflection. He admitted that his actions had been driven by deep-seated fears and prejudices. He hadn't fully understood himself until he saw how much good had come from Ellie's Eats under Marcus's ownership. Carl wrote about how he observed from afar, seeing how Ellie's Eats had become a force for unity and compassion in Brookside, and how it had ultimately made the town a better place. Carl ended the letter with a request. He asked if Marcus would be willing to meet him, to sit down over coffee at Ellie's Eats, as two people who had once been on opposite sides of a difficult story, but who had both, in their own way, changed. The invitation stirred complex emotions in Marcus. Part of him felt the old hurt rise up, memories of that morning when Carl had publicly humiliated him in front of the diner. Yet, over the years, he had seen how the community had transformed, and how Carl's old supporters had embraced the new Ellie's Eats. Marcus had learned that healing wasn't a single moment but a journey, and that his mission was always about creating understanding, even with those who had once stood in his way. Marcus accepted Carl's invitation. The two met at Ellie's Eats on a crisp autumn morning, and as they sat across from each other, Marcus could feel the years of silence between them, like an unspoken weight neither knew how to address. Carl, now older and visibly humbled, spoke first, apologizing sincerely, his words filled with the kind of honesty that only came from years of reflection. He told Marcus about his own journey, how seeing Ellie's Eats become a symbol of unity had made him confront parts of himself he wasn't proud of, parts that had caused him to hurt others, and build walls rather than bridges. Marcus listened, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over him. In that moment, he saw Carl not as the man who had once humiliated him, but as someone who had finally come to understand his own limitations and was willing to make amends. Carl's apology was genuine, and Marcus realized that forgiving him wasn't just about letting go of the past. It was about opening the door to a future where even the most unlikely people could come together in understanding. By the end of their conversation, the two men shook hands, sealing an unspoken promise to move forward without the shadows of resentment between them. It was a moment of quiet closure, a reminder that even the deepest wounds could heal when met with humility and understanding. The reconciliation with Carl marked a turning point for Marcus. He felt that Ellie's legacy had come full circle, from a place of pain and exclusion to a nationwide movement of acceptance and transformation. And yet, as time went on, he began to yearn for the roots he had left behind. He missed the daily rhythms of Brookside, the familiar faces at Ellie's Eats, and the personal connections he had nurtured there. Though he traveled often to visit the new diners across the country, his heart always returned to the town where it had all started. One day, after much reflection, Marcus made a decision. He would return to Brookside to live, dividing his time between managing the larger vision of Ellie's legacy and re-establishing himself in the place he still considered home. He knew that Brookside was more than just a chapter in his life. It was the foundation of everything he had accomplished, and he wanted to be there to guide the next generation, to mentor young people, and share his story firsthand with those who might one day continue his work. Marcus's return to Brookside was met with joy and celebration. The community he had helped transform welcomed him back with open arms, and once again, Ellie's Eats became the heart of his daily life. He found that the diner had evolved in beautiful ways. The cooperative ownership model had deepened the town's connection to it, making Ellie's Eats a true community endeavor. Locals were proud to work there, and each person who held a share felt a sense of purpose and belonging. Marcus was moved by how the diner had taken on a life of its own, becoming a legacy that was no longer his alone, but one that belonged to everyone who believed in its mission. One evening, as Marcus closed up the diner, he was approached by a young girl, no more than 12 years old, who had been helping her grandmother clear tables as part of a family share in the cooperative. She looked up at Marcus with wide eyes and asked, "Mr. Marcus, is it true that someone once told you that you didn't belong here?" Her innocent question brought a smile to his face, and he nodded, kneeling down to her level. "Yes, it's true," he said gently. "But sometimes things like that happen so we can learn how strong we really are. And when we stand up for ourselves, we make a place for everyone else too." The girl seemed to ponder his words, then smiled. "Well, I'm glad you stayed. My grandma says Ellie's Eats wouldn't be the same without you." She hugged him, then ran back to her grandmother, leaving Marcus standing in the empty diner, his heart full. In that moment, he felt the depth of what he had created, not just a place, but a legacy of belonging, courage, and love that would live on through generations. In the years that followed, Ellie's Eats and Ellie's legacy continued to grow, reaching more people and inspiring countless communities. Marcus dedicated his life to nurturing this mission, knowing that he had created something larger than himself, something that would outlast him. And in every new diner that opened, in every community that embraced the vision, a piece of Brookside's spirit went with it, spreading across the country like a quiet, powerful revolution of understanding and acceptance. Ellie's Eats remained at the heart of Brookside, a testament to one man's determination to turn a moment of rejection into a legacy of love. Marcus's story, woven into every corner of the diner, became a beacon of hope, a reminder that true change was possible, and that sometimes the most profound revolutions began in the most unlikely places.